Hello, everybody. I'm excited to be able to talk with you a little bit today about the Boston movement. Of course, this class in Global Connect has been about eyewitnesses to His Majesty, sort of the history, our history as the International Churches of Christ. And today I'm going to get to share a little bit with you about this period, mostly for the 1980s, sort of 79 to 90, what God was doing in that time period. This is where I tuned into the movie. This is where I just made my decision to become a disciple. I was baptized for the forgiveness of my sins. And this is something that I'm really excited to be able to talk about. But before we get into this, I would like us to do just a little review. Now, we heard in our first session that the International Churches of Christ, we have our roots in the Restoration movement. You remember Steve Kennard came and he spoke about that. And he talked about that time in the US as well as in Europe when people were coming together with a simple conviction to get back to the Bible. They wanted to be Christians only. And that was a very inspiring time. They were talking about unity. They were talking about laying down all the denominational distinctions and instead having a conviction to be Christians only. That's a beginning in the last couple of hundred years where we could see there was a clear moving together. Now, that's not the only time that people moved back towards fidelity to the scriptures. There were other times throughout history. I grew up going to a Church of Christ, and they would often have, if they built a building, they would have a cornerstone in the building that would say, founded 33 AD. And what they meant by that was, this is the church that traces its roots all the way back to the resurrection of Jesus in the first century. So that's our call, that's our conviction. We're not trying to reinvent the church, we're trying to restore the church. And that's our conviction today, that we're just trying to be faithful to the will of God and to the word of God. So that was in the in the early 1800s. At that point, the Restoration movement broke up into three groups: the Disciples of Christ, which was sort of the liberal wing, the Christian Church, which was sort of in the middle, and the Churches of Christ, which were the most conservative. They tried hardest, and sometimes they tried too hard to hold on to the pattern of the scriptures. I remember being in a church, or at least visiting a church early on when I was a kid, that was a one-cup church. And this was a church that said, well, if Jesus only had one cup during communion, then as Christians, we can only have one cup when we take communion. That's a very restrictive idea. That might be okay for a dinner or a group of just a handful, 12 disciples perhaps. But you start talking about a church of 100 people or 200 people, one cup becomes a real strange practice. But people held on to all sorts of things. I saw churches that refused to have a kitchen in their church building, because Paul told the Corinthians, or asked the rhetorical question, don't you have homes to eat in? And they took from that Christians were not supposed to eat food at church. Now, there's a million theological problems with that, but I'm just saying, yes, this was a group that was very dedicated to following the pattern set out in the scriptures. So that was the Church of Christ, though in the 50s and 60s of the last century, the Churches of Christ had a great period of growth and expansion. And many people became disciples. At one point, it was the fastest growing religious organization, particularly in the United States, although their global missions effort was weak at that point. It was there, but it was not very strong. But that then flowed into the campus ministry movement in the 60s and 70s. And the campus ministry, they had a goal, the vision. A lot of the leaders said, we want a strong campus ministry on every major college campus in America. Again, it was quite a narrow focus, but they had this idea that was our ambition, that was our goal, into all the campuses, not into all the world, but into all the campuses. And within the Churches of Christ, there was a group, and again, we were talking about Crossroads, the Crossroads Church. Tom and Kelly Brown talked about that, but they got a vision to plant campus ministries in all of the major cities around the country. The challenge with that was that there was an incredible zeal and dedication among the campus ministry, that people that were there, the students, but often they were placed in congregations that were not so enthusiastic. So that's where we're thinking about. That's where we came up to last week with Tom and Kelly. And today we're going to move a little bit more into the Boston ministry. But to review the campus ministry movement, again, they had a passion for reaching students for Christ. I found this picture in a notebook that I had. This is Chuck and Ann Lucas. And you know, Chuck and Ann Lucas, they were leaders in the Crossroads Church. Now, as you study history, you know, even as you read the Bible, you know that there are people, that God uses imperfect people. We think about Moses, we think about David, we think about Samson. God did some amazing things at times with some pretty complicated individuals. Chuck Lucas was that sort of a person. He was a person of great vision, and he had a conviction and a desire to inspire young people to give their lives to Christ. I remember the first time I heard him preach. He preached on the truth will set you free. I'd driven about 15 hours in a car just to be at this conference and to hear him speak, and it moved my heart. I remember the message to this day. And he did a lot of good, but he also had some personal demons and he did some harm. And in time, his sin found him out and he was taken out of the ministry. But you can't talk about campus ministry and Crossroads without talking about Chuck Lucas. And he was there, and that was part of this overall expansion. Now, for me, this is me right here. I was a soul in need of salvation when I got to campus. That was me with the little yellow circle there about 18 months before I decided to be a Christian. I was at a high school football game. My wife Joyce was a cheerleader at that time. When I went back to my 25th high school reunion, this photograph was made into a full-size, life-size poster. I had not seen most of my high school friends for 25 years. And when they asked me what I did for a living, and I said I was a preacher, I was a minister, they burst out laughing and pointed at this picture and said, "This guy, you are a minister?" And I had to confess, yes, I am. And I've repented of my sins. I've changed. And you know, that sense of young people trying to figure out what to do with their lives, that was part of this campus advance. We found the situation. I turned up at Duke University. That's where I went to school. And Duke is a beautiful campus there in Durham, North Carolina. And I came in as a freshman at the very same time that a campus minister was sent to a little church called the Coal Mill Road Church of Christ. It was a little sleepy congregation of about 100 people. And they wanted to have someone who would focus on working with the campus. And he came to campus the same year I came to Duke campus. And I filled out a form where I ticked a box that said I was part of the Church of Christ. And he had come and he went to the university and got all the people who had checked the box Church of Christ. And I was the one that he had. And so he followed up with me. This is the man, Steve Pipkin. He was just a few years older than me, but he was filled with passion and faith, and he moved my heart. Now, I ran from him for almost a year. I was not that sincere. When he first invited me, I came, but then I left, and I tried to run away and hide, and I tried to pretend I was a Christian even when I wasn't. But you know, the story that happened with him and with the Coal Mill Road Church of Christ happened all over the country with these campus ministers. Steve was a very passionate man. He preached the word. And our little campus ministry, of which I was a part, we saw 100 people baptized in 3 years, okay? And what that meant was for the little Coal Mill Road Church, it was a church that only had room for about 200 people in church, in the building. And 100 of them were old timers. And then there were 100 brand new campus Christians. And you say, well, then what was the reaction? They must have been really excited. No, they were not really excited because we were too enthusiastic and we were taking up the seats that they like to sit in, and we were too noisy and too zealous, and we caused problems, and we were too intense about our faith. And so after 3 years, they fired him as the campus minister because they didn't like all of the passion and the zeal and the conviction, which is sort of amazing, but that's what happened in church after church after church. As the scriptures say, you can't put new wine into old wineskins. And what was happening in those churches is you had a passion and a fervor. In the same period of time that you saw 100 students baptized, there were no adults baptized in that church. And so obviously the vision, the philosophy, the faith, the conviction became uncomfortable for some of the older members. And so that was the challenge. That's what happened in church after church as we went into and came through the campus ministry phase. And that now brings us then to the Boston movement, because what happened at that time, I came back from that university, Duke University, in the summer of '78. And along with another brother called John Walsh, Al Baird gave us an opportunity to lead a teen ministry. And we led a teen ministry, and I invited Steve Pipkin, that fella, to come and preach. And at that point, the church made a decision in Lexington. Are we going to close the doors, or are we going to try one more time? And they decided to try one more time. It was a small group of about 60 people. And they decided at that point they were going to hire Kip McKean to come and to lead the church. Now, what was interesting is up until this point, all of the zealous, intense, evangelistic leaders had only ever been deployed into churches as campus ministers. They worked with young people. Kip was 25 years old when he came to Lexington, which ultimately became the Boston Church. And so, but what happened in Boston for the first time is that the 25-year-old was not the campus leader, but in fact, the church leader. Now, there were elders and they worked together as a team, but it was the first time that the vision was not just to get a fired up small group, but within the congregation, but actually for the whole congregation to be united. That's what we see in all of our churches now. When you look around, the convictions of the older people and the younger people are sort of like that passage from Joel, where it talks about the young will see visions and the old will dream dreams. We're united. But up until this time, that was not the case. And so this became a very unique, a very important step when the Lexington Church invited the McKeans to come. That was in June. That was June 1st of 1979. I'll never forget the first sermon that I heard. It was entitled "Turning a Quarter Century." And I thought that was a unique, a novel way to talk about being 25 years old, which is very young. But somehow if you called it a quarter century, it made you seem older. But the vision for the church became that everyone in the congregation was going to be a disciple. Lots of stories were told about the 30 would-be disciples, this young collection, or this collection of old and young who were dreaming about doing great things for God. This is a majority of those 30 people at the 10th anniversary of, this was in 1989, but you see there on the left is Kip with his wife Elena in front in the blue. The rest of these people were people who were in the congregation at the time of 1979. The one in white in the middle is my wife Joyce. The woman to her left with white hair is my mom. But the wild thing about the disciples, this collection, is about almost half of this group are Joyce's relatives. But these are the people who signed up for this adventure to try to impact the world, to try to see God move, not just for young, but for old and for everybody in between. Although most of these people would definitely qualify as young. Most of us were in our 20s, many of us in our early 20s. But that is the start of the Lexington Church, and God blessed it quickly. Many people became Christians. Lots of things happened. And the vision then began to expand from not just campus ministry, not just a solid congregation of all ages, but actually then to take on the vision of launching the Boston School of World Missions. Now, there was a revival going on among several different churches. Tom Brown was preaching out in Colorado, and there were lots of things going on. And it's a strange time because it was very chaotic and very disorganized. And so that, how did you think about, for example, a strategy for evangelizing the world? That was a novel thought. I want to tell you something amazing. In the fall of 1980, we had essentially a young ministers training class like what you have when you go to School of Missions. And we put together, we were given the challenge, how could we evangelize the world? What would we do? How would we think about it? And much of what we came up with in that class actually became part of the strategy going forward. And so in February 14th, Valentine's Day, 1981, was the official launching of the Boston School of World Missions. Now, this is the bulletin that announces it, and it basically says, we want to go into all the world. And we have a conviction that we need to go to large cities, and we need to have a vision for the whole not only the campus, but all the population centers. And that was sort of the beginning. Now, the concept was one thing, but the real radical news was then this list of targeted cities where we're going to go. Now, you see it lists here 13 cities. Back at this time, the way you decided to send a church planting was you had to have somebody who was saying they would go, and you had to print a bulletin and claim it. It was sort of, I don't know, imperialistic or something, but people would compete. And so the Boston church decided, okay, in one day, we're going to announce that we want to go to Chicago, London, Sydney, New York, Montreal, Philadelphia, Toronto, Paris, Washington, D.C., Rio de Janeiro, Munich, Germany, Amsterdam, and Lagos, Nigeria, all within a 3-year period. Now, remember, this is early in 81, and this is saying between 82 and 85, here are the 13 plantings. So now, what happened with this, Chicago was sent by Marty and Chris Fuqua were there. Marty never actually came to Boston. He was in Illinois, but the Chicago planting started in June. The London church started in July, but this was the first time that the concept of, hey, let's try to evangelize the whole world. And not just in the Great Commission, I'm sure it would be a good thing to do, but in the practical sense of, no, actually, we want to try to put these plans in place. Let's work. And you see the first one there in June was Chicago. And then Joyce and I, along with Jim and Tanya Lloyd, were inspired to go to London. And that we started on the 4th of July in 1982. We were the second. The group in Sydney, that didn't come off. That came several years later with the replanting. The group in New York came a year after that with Steve and Lisa Johnson. Montreal didn't work out exactly like that. Philadelphia didn't work out like that. Toronto didn't work out like that. Doug and Candy Blau did go to Paris very briefly. Scott and Lynn Green were supposed to go to Washington, D.C. at this point, although later they decided to go to Hong Kong. So this was a very provisional list, but this actually was a reflection of two things. One is faith, that let's go into all the world. The other is competitiveness and a desire to claim things. And so this is kind of a historical moment, but I'll tell you what it did. It inspired young people to dream. And, this is a picture of me and Joyce right at this time. Our hair is the same color now, but it's a different color than it was back then. We were the same color then, but we were ready to go. We were dreaming about doing great things. There were lots of young people who, Joyce had just gotten baptized. I also had recently become a Christian. We were eager to go. but it also inspired older people. This is a picture of Bob Gempel and George Gerganis. Bob Gempel was my stepdad. He was married to my mom. He ultimately left his job and worked with Hope Worldwide and served as an elder for many, many years. George Gerganis was an incredible hero of mine. At this time, he was retired already. He had gone in the Second World War to Japan. And after the war, he went back to Tokyo and started a Church of Christ in a tiny little place. And they built a little wood building in the 1940s after the war. Can you imagine going back, having been an adversary during the war? Now you go back to Japan as a missionary. They built a building, a small little wood building in a part of Tokyo that ultimately, many years later, was in the heart of Tokyo. But George had served in Tokyo in Japan, learned Japanese, come back and been a professor of missions, and then ultimately retired. But when he heard about what was going on in Boston, he came out of retirement and decided to move back to Tokyo to help strengthen that church planting. So young people and old people were being inspired in an incredible way. And the desire and the opportunity to launch, to go plant churches, was something that inspired many of us. And Joyce and I were part of the Central London Church of Christ. It was born on the 4th of July, which is a little ironic that America's Independence Day from England is also the birthday of the London Church of Christ. But God was working, and the Lloyds and us went together, a team of about 8 people. That's me and Joyce on the right, and that's James and Tanya Lloyd. James was somebody that I'd reached out to in North Carolina. He became a Christian. We moved up to Boston together in 1979. He was working, and he reached out to his lovely bride, and she became a Christian, and they began living happily ever after. And we worked together to start the London Church. Here's some of the mission team. You see the woman on the far right in the red hair. That's Martha. She was Martha Coyne back then. We spoke at a conference in the Midwest, and she heard about the mission planting and just decided to go. And she served for many years, and she and her husband also worked together there in the ministry. The woman in the middle was Dr. Barbara Burke. She had a PhD in psychology, and she took a job as a nanny. She gave up her doctoral professorship and instead took a job as a nanny so she could go on the mission team, and because she could get a visa if she had a nanny job there. The fellow in the blue jacket on the left is Richard Biddulph. He was in my dorm at Boston University. He was an Englishman. I met him in the cafeteria line, and I heard his accent, and I said, "Oh, the Lord is moving." And sure enough, we studied the Bible together. He became a Christian, and he went with us on the mission team. Now, the fellow you see yawning right there is a young Doug Jacoby. He also became a Christian. He was in my dorm at Duke University, and Gary Knutson and I reached out to him. He became a disciple, and ultimately he decided to go on the mission team. We had one other fella that I met who had just become a disciple, and when I met him in the Boston church, I remember seeing him. He was a hulk of a man, incredibly impressive. He just won the collegiate national championship in wrestling in the United States, but he was born in England. And Noel Lobin, that's Noel. He ultimately went on to win a medal in the Olympics, and he's your brother in Christ. But he came with us also on the mission team. And God began to bless. We got there, and within a very short period of time, this is one of our very first baptisms. I don't know what's going on with me. I look like I'm seeing an angel, but this is Mike D'Souza. Mike D'Souza was just a high school student at the time, 16 years old. He was baptized in Regent's Park. He had an infection in his eye, so we had to cover it up because the pond in Regent's Park is not very clean. But Mike became a Christian. He was the 4th baptism. This is a picture of Mike without the patch on his eye, and the fella in his right arm is John Louis. John became a Christian in London as well, and ultimately went on to start the church in Singapore, the church in Jakarta, Indonesia. God worked in some incredible ways. And so what we see here in the 80s is that lots of people were moving to Boston to train in Boston. Boston happened to be in the right place at the right time, because a lot of these campus ministry churches that had grown to hundreds of students were beginning to rupture because of the difference in philosophy and conviction. And so many of them came to Boston to train other people who'd gone out from Crossroads and decided they wanted to expand their training. They also relocated. People were being baptized, and God was moving in a powerful way. And so what we see then here, as we're reminded, okay, we came out of the campus ministry, and then in Boston, we got that vision for the church having disciples of all ages, not just college students, but teens, college, and all the way through the mature adults, as well as the idea that we were going to go after trying to evangelize the whole world. That all happened in the decade of the 80s. And I think then right at the end of 1989, in a single day in the Boston church, the Boston church sent out mission plantings to Tokyo, Honolulu, Washington, D.C., Manila, Miami, Seattle, Dallas, Bangkok, and Los Angeles. All of those church plantings sent out in one day from the Boston church. More than 100 Bible talk leaders, family group leaders, were sent out on that day. And that was in 1989. And then in 1990, Kip and Elena moved to Los Angeles, which ultimately grew into the largest church in our fellowship. And so that's why in the decade of the 80s, okay, we see this incredible explosion of evangelism. Now, but also we see that there's a pivot in the history, and that is in 1979, the focus became the incredible growth in Boston, but by 1989, all of these churches were sent out. Now, I want to tell you something. Strategically, that did a lot of damage to the Boston church. It was very hard for a church, any church, to recover from the loss of 100 leaders, to send out 10 mission teams in a single day. That's a drain that you cannot just bounce right back from. But then also to have the inspirational leadership of Kip and Elena depart the next year, that left Boston in a difficult situation. It took them several years to recover as a congregation. But God was working in a great way. We're going to have questions and answers when we meet together in a few days. I hope this gives you a little bit of orientation, a little bit of a feel for how God worked. Of course, we're remembering our roots in being there in the Restoration movement, then coming through the Church of Christ, the campus ministry, and then how in Boston the vision and the direction changed. I hope these things help you. If you have questions, we'll look forward to talking about them. Whenever we talk about history, we always look back. Whenever we read the Bible, there was only one perfect person. There was only one perfect plan, and that's Jesus and God's plan. And for us, we did the best we knew how to do, and we see that God used very flawed people. That's what he does all throughout history. And I hope that your faith is growing to see, wow, God's taking us to a new place. In our next session together, we're going to talk about some of the international expansion that happened in the 90s. So that's going to be a great time. I hope that this discussion is illuminating, and I look forward to seeing you on Thursday when we're all together again. Thanks again for your participation. God bless.